Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the On Deck Fellowship. We are very lucky to have Keith Rabois, a good friend of On Deck and supporter from day one and investor. Keith, as you know, the On Deck Fellowship is a group of people who are looking to start or join their next thing. He's known On Deck for years. And this is the second cohort, official cohort that we've done. We have not yet had Keith lead an investment in an On Deck company. We hope to have that soon. I personally invested in 5 companies from the first cohort through Village Global, and Founders Fund led one round, which was Placement, Sean Linehan's company. But we will know when we are hitting our stride once Keith gets on board. And so we're here to talk about the earliest stages. People here are looking for co-founders, are evaluating ideas. And so I thought I'd ask the question that is most relevant to begin to everyone here and is on everyone's mind, which is that there's rumored to be a private equity group trying to buy out Barry's Boot Camp, and I'm wondering if you're behind it. $700 million, and is that you, Keith? How are you thinking about it?
No, that's way too boring a business. Yeah, I saw some journalist was tweeting about it. It was kind of amusing. That's why we're allegedly raising a growth fund. Yes. But I wish I'd done the seed round though. That might have been a better idea.
Yeah.
I just did fund something similar. Can't talk too much about it, but directionally similar.
Is it the food and nutrition combination that you've been?
No, it's more in the meditation space.
Meditation space. Wow. So I'm curious, when you work with founders who are day zero in sort of navigating the idea maze, and if you come to mind, Rishi Mandal, who's now with Future, who's an EIR at Khosla when you were there, and Michael Boswell, who just launched his latest project, who was an EIR while you were there. Maybe those as examples, we can get to others. I'm curious what your advice is for founders who know they want to be founders, don't yet have the idea, have maybe spaces they're excited about, they don't even have co-founders yet, and are sort of navigating idea mazes in different sectors at once, and just thinking about, hey, how do I think about what's the idea I want to pursue? How do you advise soon-to-be founders or founders and go in that process?
I mean, you're going to get me in trouble because generally, I don't like those kind of founders. As a general matter, I like people who have a very specific idea that they want to pursue and they can't stop sleeping. You know, the proverbial, I can't sleep at night, I can't stop proselytizing, etc. And they must do this with their lives. And it's just a question of with who should they do it, not should they do it. There are obviously like all rules in venture capital, all rules in Silicon Valley are made to be broken. So there's exceptions where that's worked. But typically, I prefer people who are very specific. And they may discover some edges that aren't quite polished, and they may polish those edges, and it may look a little bit different than when they started. But the direction of the idea was already sort of in their mind, maybe before they left their prior job. This was true of like LinkedIn. Reed had this idea of LinkedIn, a professional network, in his mind every day at PayPal for the last year, and he was just waiting to try it. He had 2 other ideas that he liked also. Fortunately, they're kind of on the ash heaps of history.
Was one of them dating?
No. He had done an early dating site in the 90s, Social Net. No, the one was a book, which might have sold well, but it certainly wouldn't have been, $24 billion business. And the other one was really bad. Really bad.
Okay, you'll have to tell me.
So one thing we could do is, if they are EIRs, what we'll try to help do is filter the ideas. Yes. Like if I were you, I might do this one and not that one. Totally. But he had a burning ambition. Open Door took, I've been sleeping on it for 10 years, which I wouldn't recommend waiting 10 years either. So those are probably the extremes. But definitely was something I'd been thinking about for literally a decade before we got it off the ground or whatever.
And so how about Rishi and Michael? And maybe the better way to say it is you have a few ideas that you're excited about and that you've been thinking about for a long time, and it's which one do you pursue?
Yeah, so you can definitely vet some of them. Some of them are easier to vet than others, like consumer products, and certainly Boswell Q is a consumer product. Rishi started that way. It's more now an enterprise product in some ways, or certainly enterprise distribution. It's a lot easier to vet enterprise ideas than it is consumer ones. Consumer ones, you may just have to build the damn thing, get some real users and see what happens and see what they try to do, see what they like, versus top-down analysis. The general filter I use, truthfully, is the more ambitious, the better. I think startups have roughly the same amount of pain to go from 0 to 1, regardless of whether one is a $1 billion company, a $100 million company, a $10 billion company, or a $100 billion company. Yeah. So you basically have this fixed cost of pain. So you might as well do something important because the pain's going to be the same. Right. So you might as well get the outcome that offsets the pain. So I tend to like things that are super ambitious, that almost are ridiculous, meaning like one of the reasons why I haven't funded any on-deck ones is I think they're not ridiculous enough. Like I have this sort of saying internally, both at KV and now at FF, Founders Fund, that I want half of my VC friends to laugh at an investment I make. Yeah. And if half don't laugh, it means I'm not taking enough risk and the projects aren't ambitious enough. I don't want all of them to laugh, but I want half.
Yeah, totally. So let's take one specific example. Maybe it's Rishi, maybe it's Boswell, maybe it's someone else where they're excited about a specific space. Maybe it's Rishi in fitness, although maybe he was thinking about nutrition too. I'm not sure. And how do you sort of advise them to narrow in on what's the first, wedge or use case or first product they should build?
Yeah. So, I mean, one is like the idea maze. I mean, Balaji still has the canonical explanation of this in his lecture notes from Stanford Startup Engineering course that, Chris Dixon summarized in a blog post a couple of years ago. But the intellectual maze, which is you really want to understand a market and opportunity well enough that you can walk anybody through with the trapdoors, the history, what looks alluring and what isn't, what's the real path to the prize. And once you master something so well, then I think you're ready to do it. Like, so Open Door, I still can walk into a meeting at Open Door and be pretty knowledgeable on any topic, despite, not being there full time and despite the fact that there's 1,600 people that are there full time, because I spent a decade thinking about it. So there's almost nothing in a decade that doesn't occur to you. Right. It's sort of like if you've seen these prison movies when you're in prison and you're writing in your cell all the time. You think about a lot of things. So if you think about stew on an idea for a decade, you've thought through a lot of permutations and all the corner cases. And, when someone says something, it's like, aha, I actually have a solution to that because I was actually thinking about that, a year ago in my sleep.
A company you funded recently is Bungalow.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious how I'm sure you looked at Comment. I'm sure you looked at all the companies in that space. How did you sort of, as an investor, navigate the idea maze of, hey, this wasn't quite the right approach, but Bungalow sort of hit on the money?
Yeah, Bungalow is a good example because it was a competitive market, which is typically not what Founders Fund does. If you read 0 to 1, we like monopoly markets where there's no competition in theory. I funded them earlier, the Series A round at Khosla, and then we just led the B at Founders Fund, and it wasn't a canonical Founders Fund investment, but they had a very specific approach that I felt had a major strategic advantage vis-a-vis all the other competitors that had tried sort of co-living before. By the time we did the B, so recently, their growth was incredibly impressive. They were actually larger than all the other co-living companies combined. So they'd already sort of figured out a formula, but that wasn't true when I invested in the A. They were the smaller actually than all the others, although maybe with a higher growth rate. But they had a very specific approach to the market that I don't know if I'll talk about publicly as much detail, but they had a strategic insight that all the other companies were not 90% of the other companies were not following. And so I felt the other ones were creating a commodity product and that there was a way to create a non-commoditized product that they were pursuing. And then, like anything else I've invested in, we really liked the founding team. We thought they had a good DNA. Their growth rate, they're somewhat inexperienced, but their growth rate was off the charts and has continued to be off the charts. So the team plus an original idea, an original vision that translated to economic leverage, if it worked, was good enough to write sort of the Series A check. The B check was mostly based upon traction.
Yeah. And so going back to Q and Future Fit, Boswell and Rishi's idea, what was ridiculous enough about those ideas?
Well, Q is great because everybody's tried, Q is basically an app that allows you to plan social stuff with your friends. This is there's 3 ideas that everybody has in college, that every entrepreneur in college wants to do the same damn 3 ideas, and they always fail.
And didn't Rishi work on a variation of that?
Yeah, he did actually. He's dumb enough to fund it. This company called Soch. But yeah, so you wind up with there's these common refrains of oh, I want to go out with my friends, where should I go? And they always fail. And I felt like Michael at least had an original vision that was distinct from the people that had failed, and at least had some ideas about why all the people that had tried this had failed. It doesn't mean his formula is going to work, but at least he was consciously aware why the other ones had failed. And then eventually someone will create a product that's a pseudo-social calendar. Whether calendar is the right term, you can debate. But there is a human desire to find something interesting to do with blocks of time. That's an inevitable formula. So maybe I'll compare this to DoorDash. So when DoorDash, Tony had been an intern of mine on my team at Square. And when he told me he wanted to do like this food delivery thing, I looked a little quizzically at him. Like, are you sure? Kind of reaction. And then I thought about it, and immediately this kind of comment that Andrew Mason, founder of Groupon, had said publicly a while ago, sort of sticking in my brain, where Andrew had said should be only two buttons on your phone. One is I'm bored and one is I'm hungry. And as Tony was explaining this, I was like, oh, this could be the I'm hungry button. And I'm like, yeah, I'm hungry button. Well, that's a pretty big market. Now the hard part is, can you fucking do this? Like, broad selection, affordable, consistent delivery, all those are really hard, but the demand was infinite. Like I was like, if you could do that at an affordable price reliably, people will click that button all day long. And so then the question was, could Tony and his original team, which included Evan Moore and, his two other co-founders, were they the people that could figure out whether it was possible to actually do this? And the answer in my mind was yes. They had the right skill sets for what that was, which is really a logistics and math problem. You could break down why that's true. But then all of a sudden the lights went off and like, oh, this is a no-brainer investment as a seed round.
Yeah. And how do you think about people who come with a problem they're passionate about or they've experienced personally, either the past company or as a user consumer? And then when you think, you know what, this is a problem, but it's just not big enough. And if you search this adjacent problem, for example, people who have some, niche problem in healthcare or something, like a huge market, but just trying to tackle the wrong problem. Are there times where you sort of edit the idea a little bit? And what does that look like?
I don't think problems are usually I don't do TAM analysis for the most part, or maybe ever. Now, maybe that's somewhat intuitive, which is reacting to an idea and kind of triangulating to math rather than actually bottom up building a spreadsheet or something. But I think actually the real issue with TAM is you don't create something that creates enough economic transformation so you don't capture enough value. Yeah. So it's not that there's not enough people or enough customers. It's that you capture such a small amount because what you do is so marginally valuable that it's hard to add up to be a massive company. So the value proposition basically is too weak. So what I would basically reframe the problem back to a founder would be, how do you make the value proposition more compelling? And if the value proposition is more compelling, you're going to capture more. So basically, you typically capture between 10 and 30% of the value you create. Yep. Across all software companies for 50 years, it's somewhere between 10 and 30%. So make the amount you capture really large, and then 10% of that can be a big number, and that can be fairly substantial. Same thing is true of sales cycles. As your value proposition becomes more succinct and more powerful, sales velocity increases. So long sales cycles are a function almost always of a poor value proposition, not of large customers. Large customers can buy something. If you can if you can make Walmart's revenue grow by 10%, they will buy your product really fast. Yeah. They're very capable of buying in 30 days or less. They just don't usually believe that you're going to move one of the top 3 business needles for them, because it's actually quite difficult to move a top 3 metric for Walmart. Anyway, the basic point is, to me, it's the question of the magnitude of the value proposition and what does that do to the pre-existing world. And if it's a massive transformation, hence my point about ambition and ridiculousness, if it's going to be a massively transformative, a lot of people will think that's silly or can't work or is impossible. But then you're typically likely to capture enough, and then you add up to real money pretty fast, versus this is just too quote unquote small. The small thing becomes a filter more if there's some obvious reasons why it just can't translate. Yeah. There are some things that are self-contained where they don't really apply to the rest of the market around that, but that's pretty rare actually. I was thinking in 7 years, almost 7 years as a VC, have I ever really rejected anything on a TAM? Probably not. I can't think of an example where everything else seemed good, right, but the TAM was felt small. Yeah.
Have you worked with any founders that you that have had to pivot?
Of course, yeah.
And so, what is that conversation like? When do you as a founder realize, hey, this isn't the right direction to go to? We need to do something totally different.
Typically, it's a result of frustration. Yeah. So something's not working. The velocity of growth isn't there. The velocity of sales isn't there. Something's amassed, and for a persistent period of time.
But how do you determine whether it's an execution problem or it's actually the market's not there?
Yeah, I think usually you try. I mean, it's like trial and error. You try it's like right on a whiteboard. What are my 10 best ideas to change this? Yeah. And you kind of go like through them in some order. And at some point you hit diminishing marginal returns. Like usually you have your best ideas first or, in some list. And so if you get through your top 10, nothing seems to be changing. It's unlikely your 11th idea is much better than the first 10.
Yeah.
Now, once in a while in doing the 10, you have an epiphany. Like you see something, hear something. I had this actually happen twice today, the same meeting. There's this company that's doing okay, but not great. And we were trying to figure out why. And I was basically giving them the feedback like, look, I wouldn't just believe that your sales stuff's suddenly going to magically get better. You've had enough shots on goal. You have enough unique salespeople. You have enough calls per day, et cetera. Nothing seems to really be accelerating. Yeah, you have some micro victories. And it's like, what is the root cause? Like, what's going to change the inertia for your customers? And as we started going through this conversation, one of the founders looked up and he's like, well, we could try this. He's like, well, like why? I said, why? And he said, well, I have one customer who said he'll give me $10 million if I do that. I'm like, I would not be sleeping if I were you. I'd be doing that right now. Like, you're kind of a struggling Series A business and $10 million is a lot of money. I'm like, go fix that and then see if he actually meant it. So like you could occasionally get to this epiphany where you're like, oh, we should try that.
Yeah.
And then but if not, then you either have to admit that this thing's not going to work, or can you discover a path forward? An entrepreneur who's been pretty successful, I know, once said to me, it's like pivot should also, for the most part, involve some synergy between what you've learned before and what you're doing and where you're going. Like think of the basketball terminology, you kind of have to keep one foot down.
Yeah.
So if you take both feet off the ground, it's not pivoting.
Yeah.
So if there's no connection to what you've been doing, you might be better off restarting the company in some other way.
Unless you're LeBron or James Harden, at which point,
in which case
you can travel all you want.
You redefine.
So you much prefer founders who have been thinking about a problem for a long time, or passionate.
It doesn't have to be a long time. It can be like,
or either felt the problem.
I literally wake
passionate.
up in the morning like I'm incredibly frustrated by X. Like what the hell? And why does this have to be that way? Because sometimes it is an epiphany. Like I funded a healthcare company that's doing pretty well, and part of the founding story was the founder's brother had like serious heart issues. And, as he was walking through, like, what do I have to do to help my brother? He realized this whole thing is a mess. And, so it can be like a sudden epiphany.
Right. But you're more, so this might be an exception. The Thumbtack team, for example, and I think one of them might be an MBA or maybe two of them might be MBAs. Yeah. And you know them, did sort of a sober analysis of a bunch of different ideas and then, came to the realization that Amazon for services would be a big idea.
Yeah. I'm not the sober analysis kind of founder type. Like, I'm usually more the world should be different and I'm going to will it, into existence kind of like top down. Like I just don't like X. Yeah. I want to go fix it. So for example, I have a group of founders I haven't funded quite yet, but I hopefully will. I won't tell you the specifics, but they're working on a climate change problem. And they're just ideologically convinced that they can fix climate change. So I'm like, great. Go tell me what the first product is. And they have some good ideas actually. And I was like, great, here's the money. Just tell me when you want the money. Yeah. But it was more like they woke up and said, like, this is ridiculous. Like, we want to fix it. And we need to define the problem so that our impact is big enough. Yeah. So that people will notice. Totally. So they spec'd out, like, here's a quantitative metric of our first product has to move the needle this much or it just doesn't matter.
That's a great example because that's a market where a lot of people have lost a lot of money in the last decade or so and beyond. So what do you think is different about how this group is thinking about it or the opportunities to pursue climate change opportunity now that maybe, a whole host of startups, failed a decade ago? What's sort of the why now?
Well, part of it's the why now is the right people. I know two of the three quite well, and I think extremely highly of them, so I trust them to do things that other people would miss. And even just how they're thinking about it. Usually random startup founder walks in my office and wants to tackle something like climate change. There's usually some things they haven't thought about. Yeah. Like, there wasn't anything they hadn't thought about. Like, they defined the problem well. They thought about it, ambitious criteria for success. They thought about different ways of tackling the market. They were going to prioritize one or two. It was a quite thoughtful dive into where to start. And then they're vetting and validating some assumptions because it is the kind of market and product that you can at least validate some things with. Yeah. The awareness, certainly the social awareness and the, I don't know if the scientific evidence is any different than it was like X years ago, but like the awareness of other people that might be customers that would help contribute to the solution is probably pretty different. And that might move the needle for them. They might get early customers. They also had some proof points of what they're thinking about from a product perspective That's probably something that's happened in the last, I don't know the exact dates, but call it 1 to 3 years. Yeah. So the proof points of what they want to do, but if they could scale it down sort of, exist. And I don't know if that was true before.
Where are you in the spectrum of, there's the YC, make something people want, talk to customers, and there's sort of what was the Henry Ford quote or something? If I talk to customers, I would build faster horses.
Yeah.
Or maybe Steve Jobs quoting him. Where are you on that spectrum? Or maybe what times do certain quotes, apply better?
I mean, I'm typically more of the Steve Jobsian, make something and then sell it. Like I always talk about it in terms of movies. To me, a startup's like a movie. Yep. You sort of write the script and then you cast the actors and you produce it, which is financing it. And then you make a trailer and that's how you market it. And then you sell tickets. And you start with a vision and then you sort of do all these pieces. There are occasional counter exceptions. I just funded another one where the person started with a very, very narrow product, and it's become fairly addictive. And it's addictive in a smaller community, but it definitely seems to be spreading nicely. It's addictive enough that I was doing a podcast interview recently, and someone asked me what my most used app on my phone was, and I accidentally almost gave the answer, which is this startup product. I'm like, oh, he probably doesn't want me to do that. So I'm like, Twitter. Caught myself just in time. So it's pretty addictive, and he's going to try to extrapolate from that. But that's pretty rare. Now, he is tackling a problem that's canonically a bit of a failure for other people. So I think given that most people have tried the top-down approach and failed, the bottom-up approach that seems to be working might be a better path. Yeah. So there's it's the classic exceptions to every rule. The reason why I like the exception is he has evidence that it can spread in kind of a single-player-esque mode, then it becomes a network mode. And for a consumer product, that usually predicts success.
Yeah. How do you recommend people think about co-founders? There's sort of the age-old of, like work with someone you've known for a decade. But I wonder if it's sort of mirrored sort of advice on dating, which is, now there's Tinder, now there's On Deck.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a reasonable question because, look, the classic strategy of dating yields in the U.S. like roughly a 50% divorce rate. Mm-hmm. And at least I feel like the co-founders we fund probably have roughly a 50% divorce rate. So maybe there's a better approach. Now, part of it's working together is challenging in a startup. It's a, pretty tough crucible. Secondly, things change, the velocity of change. Like a relationship, actually, as far as I can tell, it's a lot easier when your relationship to have a stable relationship when things aren't changing, and it's very difficult on a relationship when one person or the other person goes through a massive transformation in their own lives. Yeah. So the more predictable environment, I think, is better for human decision making. Startups, by definition, are going to go through hopefully very rapid change, and so predicting what this person or people are going to be like through periods of rapid evolution, it may not be possible. So typically, the way I think about founders is a different prism, which is what are the core risks to your company? Every company has different risks. Like if you wanted to compete with Elon and build rockets, it's very different than if you wanted to build a Q competitor. Yep. So what I'd like to see is somebody who's excellent, like i.e. world-class, at each of the risks on the founding team. Yeah. So first, go to the whiteboard. What are the core risks of the company? List them out. And then ideally plot the current team against them and make sure you have kind of world-class talent against each of the core problems. So and if not, go get the person. Yeah. So like, for example, when we were founding Opendoor, we obviously needed a world-class data scientist. It's the core of what we do is asymmetrically price the ability of a home sight unseen. Without a data scientist, that doesn't make that much sense. Erik doesn't know much about data science, but he knows a lot about real estate. And I know a decent amount about data science, but not enough to build a team or really run a team, except at a very high level. Happen to have a good world-class data scientist in my back pocket that neither Erik nor JD, my other co-founders, had ever met before. And I was like, aha, I got just the guy for you. You should have coffee with this guy named Ian. And then, ping Ian. I'm like, hey, Ian, what are you doing tomorrow? And I'm like, hey, do you want to get together? So I met up with Ian. I'm like, selling one idea. Like, Erik, I'm going to introduce you to Ian. You guys should meet. And then you are off to the races. But Opendoor would be terrible to pursue without someone like Ian.
Yeah. So let's, whether it's Boswell or Rishi or someone else, what's an example of some core risks to a company like that they need to solve?
Yeah, I mean, it does vary. These days, a core risk that people are looking for is some machine learning AI talent, right? Yeah. If you don't have one, it's pretty bad. Let's take a firm. So a firm back in the early days, there was a couple key risks to a firm, really mostly around underwriting. So basically the idea is a firm effectively gives financing to people who are mispriced by FICO scores or have very limited FICO scores, and that's a big market. So you have to underwrite better than FICO. That's a question of, can you get your hands on the right data? Can you model it correctly? That's one risk. The second risk, a little more subtle, is a fraud risk, which is different than an underwriting risk. Underwriting is basically the person wants to pay you, they just don't have the money. Fraud is someone's intentionally abusing the fact that they can get this product online now, and then they'll figure out how to walk away from it with like a fraudulent identity or something. The core team had both the underwriting and fraud experience, and it would have been disastrous actually to do the company without both, because even if you got the underwriting right, you would lose too much money on the fraud side. Max is pretty good himself and certainly knows enough to be dangerous, but his original co-founder, this guy Nathan Gettings, who'd run risk and fraud at PayPal with me back in the day, and then also co-founded Palantir. So he's probably the single best person on the planet to build the beginning of this. That made it immediately fundable.
Yeah. There are times where, you'll meet the right founder and say you're missing somebody on the team. Is that you basically aligning the core risks to the team?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, that's the best feedback. So sometimes we'll invest anyway, and then we'll work with the founder to go recruit the person. Because sometimes, like, the problem is sometimes it's a network problem of, like, let's talk, I'll give you the Stripe example, which is kind of in the public domain. One of the first 10 employees at Stripe was their general counsel, which is pretty rare, but they needed someone who's a world-class general counsel to streamline the product. There is sort of a navigation around partner dependency and regulatory dependency. And had they not found this guy named John, who's an excellent lawyer, they would have been in deep trouble very fast and maybe never gotten out of it. So not every founder, though, knows how to find a general counsel. So Source certainly doesn't know how to assess a general counsel, and then may or may not know how to close one. So one thing an investor can do is help you with that. Like I have a network of GCs. I certainly know how to assess GCs and can help close GCs. Same thing, CFOs. CFOs are usually not that strategic early. But if you're a company like Opendoor or a firm that uses debt as oxygen, so we use debt to buy properties or to loan money to consumers, you need someone who understands how to do capital markets pretty early, or you just won't be able to grow because basically you're turning this debt into your source of growth. So depending on what the company does, the skill, but a lot of engineer type founders wouldn't know how to go find a capital markets person or a CFO type person. Yeah. You just don't live in the same social networks.
What about other do's and don'ts as it relates to selecting the right co-founder and as it relates to not divorcing or not ruining the co-founder relationship, while also knowing that sometimes the co-founder relationship is meant to be short term, or like that person is going to be helpful in the beginning and might not scale with the company. Is that something you walk into knowing that might happen?
Yeah. I mean, I care more that this person who's the CEO, I have a lot of conviction and confidence in, because ultimately, with very few exceptions, there's usually like one real founder who is the driving CEO.
And does that person need to have originated the idea in the first place?
Not necessarily, no. They need, like Erik didn't originate the idea at Opendoor at all, but he's definitely the CEO. Yeah. So someone needs to assume the mantle of responsibility and be able to handle all that entails. That's the most important thing, that if we write a check, certainly a founder's fund for our brand, we really care that there's one person who's the CEO that we're backing. And, we don't vote to fire CEOs, et cetera, et cetera. We could talk about that at length, but fundamentally, if we don't have conviction around the CEO, we're not going to invest. But how the CEO decides to edit the team over time, that's really the CEO's prerogative. Yeah. We may have feedback. There's a little bit like baseball metaphor here is you have a starting pitcher who gets you, call it a lead in the first 6 innings. Typically for the last 50 years in baseball, like other relief pitchers, take over the game. And the art is partially knowing when you sort of need the relief pitcher. Yeah.
Parker Conrad had this view, Parker, former CEO of Zenefits, obviously, had a personal experience with venture capitalists. And he says, in response to sort of this, ethos of the VC say, hey, it's like a marriage. He says, no, it's more like a general contractor or a plumber or something. Let them come in, do a good job, but don't let them run away with your house or something.
I don't know which general contractors he works with. Mine definitely don't do. Mine definitely think they run the place.
But do you think CEOs should basically never be ousted, or how is your?
Well, our view at Founders Fund is we will not, oust them. Typically, what happens, truthfully, is the CEOs that get replaced lose the confidence of their own team. So every time I've personally been involved, it's the team below the founder or CEO that actually is frustrated as hell. Yeah. And they either threaten to quit, they actually quit, or they lobby the board to make a change. and the board member's VC gets kind of caught in the crossfire and someone has to make a decision. That's almost always what's happened is it's a bottom up. The people doing all the work have lost faith in the CEO versus like some top down view that the CEO is not doing his or her job.
Right. I want to talk about some different spaces that you've explored ideas in, built companies and invested in, and talk about how you've navigated the idea maze through that. So real estate, Open Door, you've thought about since 2003. You've invested in other companies in real estate, obviously Bungalow. Why was that the idea within real estate that you were so excited about? And how did you settle on that specific one?
Yeah, I mean, really it started with an idea. Peter Thiel told me to go find something interesting to do in residential real estate, primary residential real estate. And I said, why? And he said, well, it's the largest asset class in the world that's been unaffected by technology. And I'm like, okay, sounds good. So I went out and, spent a couple weeks, like, coming up with ideas, basically, doing exactly what I don't like.
Yes.
Although top down, like Peter, residential, primary residential real estate. So not totally undirected. But I worked with this guy, Steve Stegman, who I'd hired out of Stanford. And we came up with this idea. There's a little bit banal of we would basically create something that looks like Zillow today. This is 2003, so before Zillow. And we'd basically stamp home prices on each house. And so after 2 or 3 weeks working on this, we pitched it to Peter about 30 seconds to 3 minutes. I can't remember exactly, in the conference room, get into the pitch. And Peter's like, oh, that's so boring. And he basically kicks us out.
Wow.
So I'm kind of used to this. I'd worked for Peter for 2 years when he was CEO of PayPal. And so Steve and I go back to our little office space, and Steve's like, I'm going to get fired. And he's like terrified. He's like 22. Yeah. I hired him like 3 years out of, like he'd basically done a 3-year degree at Stanford. And I'm like, no, don't worry. It'll be fine. So Steve's terrified. Anyway, the next day we come back to work, and I had this like thought that, well, if we're going to put damn prices on it, why don't we just buy the properties? Like, the hard part is putting the price on. Yeah. Once you do that one, we just buy them. For the price. And it took us 2 or 3 weeks to figure out whether that was like legally possible. Yeah. Like, was there a blocker, like a binary blocker, which actually I think is a useful exercise of not should I do this, but is there some fundamental principle of physics that doesn't allow what I want to do? And it took us 2 or 3 weeks because it's fairly complicated. And we came back and figured out we could do it. And so then we went back and pitched Peter. And this time Peter loved the idea. Wow. So it was like, night and day. There's actually lots of reasons why I liked it. But one was it leveraged the federal government, which was awesome. Like, we're basically arbitraging mortgages that are subsidized by the government. But among other good things about the vision, but it was sufficiently differentiated that it cut through the clutter. Like, the criteria was it must cut through the clutter. We didn't want to spend a lot of money on paid marketing, that the idea had to be original or ridiculous enough. Like, even as late as 2013 and 14, when we launched Open Door, most people thought it was ridiculous. Certainly people in real estate absolutely did. If you read any of the trade pubs, or if you asked Spencer, who's the CEO of Zillow, whether it was possible, he actually said publicly it wasn't. So these ideas moved from, ridiculous to very possible very quickly.
And now he's trying to do it. Right?
Yeah, well, he got fired, but he's encouraged, his company is trying to do it. Or he didn't get fired, he got just encouraged to leave or spend more time with the family or whatever one does. So these ideas move quickly. But Peter was really from the adamant that it had to be differentiated enough that it immediately cut through the clutter. Yeah. And basically, it shouldn't be boring. It needs to be like so different that you have a shot of making it work.
So Peter brings up 2 questions I want to ask. One is going back to founders. How about when 2 really talented people think that they should be the CEO? And I just want to segue to the sort of PayPal story, which I feel is like undertold in some sense. There's no Twitter novel, you're hatching Twitter is sort of this CEO switch, where Peter Thiel or some group ousted Elon Musk. I mean, it's a pretty crazy story. What happened there? And we learned when really talented people are arguing over who should be CEO.
Yeah, fortunately, it doesn't happen that often, or at least in our experience. It's actually one of the reasons why VCs get caught in the crossfire. I think 80% of the negative feedback about VCs is a function of a co-founder dispute that somehow or another ends up on the desk of the VC because 2 people get in a fight and someone has to resolve it. And inevitably, you're going to wind up alienating somebody. Yeah. And there's no way around it. The more investments you make, the longer your career is, this is just going to happen. And so you wind up with these people don't like you by definition. That's part of the job is definitely I've had to do this myself, and it's never fun. Fortunately, it's not that often. typically either the inertia of the person who was the CEO, sort of stays the CEO unless there's some, major change, or one of them leaves, and they kind of work it out internally. But, I actually have one, right, not an acute one, more of a well-managed one, I'd say, where they're working through it themselves. Yep. But it's like a divorce kind of thing, and they're working through it, and they want my feedback. Is this like the right answer? But my feedback is mostly like, you can make either path work. You guys just have to decide. You know the company better than I do. And if you think this is the right answer, I could see a theoretical argument for either of you staying as CEO, but I agree that both of you not being on the same page. And back to the co-founder selection, which I kind of glossed over. I think the most important thing in co-founder selection, other than is marry somebody who can help you solve a core risk, is agree on first principles. Right. Like, always work with someone who agrees on first principles. You cannot be debating first principles all the time in a startup. It is incredibly destructive. So, like an example, sometimes people understand what I mean by first principles, sometimes they don't. So I'll give you an example. If you happen to be like a closed ecosystem person, think like Apple iOS, you do not want to work with a co-founder who believes in open systems and Android-like products. You're just going to fight over every damn decision all the time. And the company's going to get absolutely nothing done while you're fighting. So you need to align on some core like principles like that. And it's fine. Either, obviously you can build open stack companies that have done okay, and you can build closed stuff. But you want to work with people who generally 90% of the time are going to be aligned on the principles. And then it's the question of the application of the principles to the specific facts. Same thing on people. This one's harder to test up front. You cannot build a company where the two most important people in the company are fundamentally disagreeing about the value of various other people in the company. You can have shades of difference. Like, I can grade you an A-, and this other person can say you're an A. But it doesn't work if the other person thinks you're a C. And I'm like, he's an A. That just is incredibly painful when the senior most people in the company, whether they're founders or executives, disagree. And so that is very difficult to figure out in advance if you haven't worked with someone before. So that is a source of, sort of unavoidable friction. But when it works and when you generally agree on how people are performing their job, it can be extremely healthy.
Yeah. And in the PayPal situation, was that an example of two different views of looking at the world? Or
I think so. I mean, I joined PayPal after Peter came back as interim CEO, actually. So a little detail there. Elon had been fired in August of 2000.
Well, he was on vacation or something?
Yeah, exactly. He tweeted about it yesterday, which I retweeted. It was like, don't go on vacation. You're going to get fired. So he did go on vacation. He did get fired. So one lesson was like vacations equal firing. Anyway, he did go on vacation. He got fired. I was on a plane to South Africa or something. And then Peter came back as interim CEO. Now, there's a kind of a weird history that, is a little unique that you kind of have to know to understand this, which is Elon's company, X.com, had merged with Peter's company, PayPal, in a 50-50 merge earlier that year. So it kind of set up an odd dynamic that you probably wouldn't have in an organically growing company.
Right.
So it was always a little odd because of that. Elon, in fact, was not even the first CEO. The first CEO is this guy named Bill Harris, who's the CEO of Elon's version of the company and inherited the CEO role. He lasted 6 weeks. Wow. So then Elon took over. Elon lasted less than 3 months. Then Peter took over as interim CEO on September 25th, 2000. So I joined November. So 6 weeks after Peter came back as interim CEO. And one of the reasons why he was interim CEO was there was enough animosity on the board that no one would give him and confer the official title. He eventually got the official CEO title in January. So he did a pretty good job from September to January to convince everybody he wasn't crazy and that he could execute the business. But it was, 3 CEOs in, call it 6 months isn't, a good sign of success usually. Yeah. It did work out. Peter turned around the company and was able to make the company, go from burning $10 million a month and, like less than 3 months of runway, less than 3 months of cash in the bank in the worst economic environment for technology ever, and make the company both break even and profitable in like less than 6 months. Wow. So, and then we filed our S1 to go public and blah, blah, blah. And actually, we're able to go public in 2002, which was pretty rare.
And was Elon not executing during his?
Elon was executing in the wrong direction. The burn was going up. The fraud losses were going up. The brand was going down. The technology decisions were crazy. Like, he basically alienated everybody in the company for different reasons. So the product team hated it because he wanted to rebrand the company from PayPal to X.com. Yeah. The engineering team hated it because he wanted to build on .NET, which is insane. And the finance people hated it because we were losing money left and right and running out of money very quickly.
And would you look at him as CEO of XICOM and then CEO of what's the next company he started after? I don't know, Solar City or Tesla or something, as just a radically different person? Or
I don't know. I mean, I'm not as close to the ground, but I think like many people, like whether it's Jack or Elon or Steve Jobs, who I don't know, but the other two definitely do. People learn from tumultuous experiences, and they're like the reaction is this is not going to happen again. Yeah. So they either change some of their approaches or get better at some things, or they find a complement, which is a key thing, a key skill. Certainly that was the Steve Jobs path. Was when he came back to Apple, one of the first things he did actually under the radar was he hired Tim Cook. Yeah. Because one of his diagnoses of why Apple Generation 1 failed was it was always an operational mess. Right. And they were losing money in unnecessary ways constantly, which is actually true. And if you sort of read the books about the history of Apple, that was definitely true. So he's like, that's not going to happen again. I'm going to get a world-class operational expert and we're going to have a supply chain and we're going to ship things reliably.
Totally. And you've been that compliment as well, too. Yep. In your career to, Jack.
Lots of crazy people.
Yeah. Vinod, Peter.
Twice. Three times.
Yes. And so, Max Levchin. And so are you often telling startups, hey, subconsciously, go find your Keith Rabois. Go find the person who's going to channel your craziness into a business equation?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's that way. It's more that a good compliment. Every founder is a little different. They have great strengths, so they wouldn't be like, especially that list, is all world class and very in some of them in multiple dimensions at the same time. But they do need a compliment. Everybody needs a compliment. Yeah. It's like basketball. So if you have a great point guard, what you're looking for is a little different than if you start with a center, and so you're triangulating from there. One of the things I've been able to do is pair with people and compliment them. And the reason why is typically I don't have my own vision. Like, in other words, I've been able to convince very strong-willed and opinionated people that effectively I can implement their vision versus like try to change it. If you have a slightly different vision, it's not that easy to get the confidence of somebody to be able to put down, sort of train tracks in the right places because they think you might be compromising the vision. Because sometimes the art is, I need to do X, Y, or Z before we go forward on something. And that's to make sure it doesn't blow up. Right. And if the person has any doubts about your fidelity to the vision, when you're suggesting slowing down or pausing or rearranging things, they may get nervous that we're not actually going to get to their destination. So for me, it was pretty easy because I rarely have top-down visions like I did with Open Door, and I have one I'm kind of working on now, but it's not that common for me. Yep. So it's easy for me to subscribe to someone else's vision if it's compelling and has all, sort of the core ingredients. So then I can earn the trust of, okay, we're definitely going to get to the point you want to get to. You just got to give me a day or a week or an hour to put like the fundamental pieces in place so it doesn't blow up on us.
And I was going to ask, have you wanted to be the person who had your own vision as well? But you have, of course, with Open Door. And yet it still feels somewhat different than, say, well, I was going to say Jack, but actually Jack's running two companies at the same time too. So, but, Erik is the CEO of that vision and, executing full time. Obviously you're very involved, but it's,
yeah, I mean, I had the original insight, the top-down vision on a couple subsidiary pieces, but the most important thing there was a cut through the clutter vision. And then the question was how to make it happen. So Erik and team have been excellent and outstanding at how to actually do this and fill in the gaps. We had some ideas. Like if you look at our seed deck, which is really just the four of us brainstorming, it reads still pretty well. I think we got the directional arc of what we needed to do, why it would work, what the key pieces would be pretty accurately. But there's a hell of a lot of moving pieces underneath the hood. Yeah. I mean, just even running a company of 1,400 people is incredibly consuming, period. Just the operational execution and management of 1,400 people, is a very high order bit.
Totally. So then I want to come back to Peter again because he said, hey, Keith, look at residential real estate. What's your sort of, Peter, like insight as to when, the next Keith Rabois comes to your desk and says, and you say, hey, look at this. What are your areas where you're saying?
I don't have that many. Again, I'm more like what would be called a bottoms up investor, which would be, someone walks in and they convince you that they can see the future. Yeah. Like the world is going to be this way. Like as I talked about, like in climate change, I didn't have any ideas about climate change. I'm not even the biggest advocate for climate change work, but the people walked in and they were like, we know how to solve this. And okay, tell me more. And then I asked a set of questions and answers are pretty compelling. That sounds like a pretty good path.
Right.
So I've had a couple recently. Like, I'm very interested and talked about publicly in homeschooling. Been trying to find companies to fund in homeschooling because under the radar for the last 30 years, it's been like probably the biggest public policy victory in many ways that nobody knows about. So roughly 10% of Americans are homeschooled these days, and the evidence of their performance, both academically and socially, is much better than anything else they can do. But it's a lot of friction on the parents. I mean, homeschooling is real work, and a lot of parents either don't have the time or don't think they have the time, but they also don't have the confidence. They're a little scared about like screwing up their child. And so this is a classic thing that we can do, is build products that make things easier, less friction, and give people more confidence that they're doing the right thing. But no one's done it yet. So I've been looking for that, pretty actively, and hopefully making some progress there. I've been looking for something around how do you achieve your goals, which we've talked about in your podcast previously, making a little less fast progress there. But, if the time metric is 10 years, I'll definitely do it before 10 years. But we're going on 3 right now, so it's getting late.
And you've also been curious about cybersecurity.
Yeah, so I funded not less cyber security than cyber insurance. So had a belief that cyber insurance would be an interesting market, that Silicon Valley would be well suited to solve versus the large incumbents in the insurance space. And we found a company after about a year of searching, actually at KV a few years ago, that we funded, called AtBay, which is a great company and doing very well. But yeah, that was like either bottom up or top down. We want to find a company that can do cyber insurance. And we happen to find a pre-existing company that we could fund, which certainly makes my job easier.
Cool. So how about homeschool? How have you thought about what's the right wedge or entry point to the market? Or conversely, what's the core risk?
Yeah. Well, the core risk is one of the reasons, or the biggest driver, I think, that parents choose homeschooling is they want to be in control. Like, they have either ideological or other perspectives, and they want to ensure that their kids, sort of learn things they want them to learn at the pace they want them to learn. The problem with a product is it homogenizes things typically, right? So it's like, how do you have something that applies, that makes your life easier as a parent, but that doesn't undermine the whole point of homeschooling, which is the personalization, customization, individual speed for the kid to learn, et cetera. Very fine balance there. And I didn't know the answer. Partially, I wasn't homeschooled. If anything, I'm the opposite of public school, over-degreed kind of person. But I found a founder who was homeschooled and had a vision of what you could do without destroying the quality.
Yeah. Totally. And for you, is it important for founders to have domain expertise, or when is it important for founders?
Well, this is a rare example where it actually kind of was. I kind of did want a founder who'd been homeschooled. Not that I would have a binary exclusion against it in this case, but I felt like probably triangulating what would be the product would be pretty hard to do without a homeschooling experience.
Have credibility.
Yeah. Well, I'm worried less about the credibility, about like just knowing what to build, having insight into what parents really need. Now, I think there's ways to get there, but typically I don't like domain expertise. We had this talking point at PayPal that 3 people in the company of, call it 254 people in the Bay Area, had any financial services expertise. That's it. To me, that's about the right ratio. Square is roughly the same. That'd be even including me, as like an expert. And definitely I wasn't. But so people who are experts tend to know what you can't do very well. They've mastered the rules. They typically don't ask enough why questions of why not. Why can't this be done this way? Why not? So I like people who kind of don't know what they're tackling a bit. And then they're very fast learners though. And they find people who have the history and the experience, and they can extract the key information out of them. So that they're not blind. They're just very good at figuring out what they need to learn really fast. So for example, when I do diligence and call up an expert, I never ask the expert like what they think of X. Experts never like X. They're not very innovative. But I asked the following version of the question, which is there a reason why this absolutely cannot work? What specifically? Point me to something that makes this impossible. And if they can't give me a very specific answer, then I'm totally convinced it's doable.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Is there a law of physics somewhere that I'm missing? Because I don't know physics all that well.
Yeah. One idea I've sort of, other people are pursuing, I'm sort of just curious about, and I've tweeted about, is basically, I think therapy is somewhat of a racket, in that I just think it's too expensive. It's unclear what expertise they have. And I'm curious if you can make a market that's way more affordable for sort of volunteer listeners. If you can unbundle a part of the therapy that's like psychiatric or whatever, and just say, hey, this is a place for people to vent, for conversations, and make it $20 an hour, so to speak. So this is sort of behavior that doesn't yet exist or doesn't exist sort of at scale. But the response I get from everybody is, that's what friends are for. And to me, it feels like kind of a just dumb response, or like, no, they need therapy. Like, why? Oh, because they're trained. I don't know. It doesn't feel like.
So there is a version of this at a YC a few years ago called Seven Cups. Yeah. It's basically that.
Yeah. It's text based. I'm curious for sort of in-person.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the problem with friends is, first of all, not everybody has friends, or doesn't have it. Or like one of the issues that leads to therapy is like not being happy with your friend situation. So that's one. So you sort of have a problem there. It's a little circular. Second problem is there are issues you want to talk about that, there's stigmatization too. And like the last people you want to talk about are your friends.
Yeah.
So you have some challenges there as well that, a different group would actually be better at solving. Yeah. The question I'd have is, how do you confirm that it's the efficacy? Yeah. And how do you do that early? Like, so if I was doing this, I'd want to launch with credibility and not and have like some empirical or other convincing evidence that this works on par. So the homeschool stuff took a while. Yeah. The academic performance came in pretty quick, but then there was this, critique that, the kids are socially maladjusted. This is proven to be totally false, by the way, but it took almost like a decade of just kids growing up. And then you could do all the kind of research on the kids and show that they're actually more adjusted than the average normal public school or private school kid from the same controlling for all demographics. Yeah. So my question would be, if you're right, which you may be right, that you can unbundle this, how do you show that it's really effective as fast as possible?
Yeah, that's interesting. And that to me is an example of sort of a dogma that exists that doesn't really make sense that experts have, that if you sort of take a look at maybe.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of expert dogma. So, for example, I funded this self-driving car company at both KV and now at Founders Fund that has a completely different approach than what all the AI experts like. Yeah. And at first, everybody at KV thought I was crazy because there actually are AI experts there, and they thought this is insane. But I was convinced that I had found a world-class, extraordinary founder. And my colleague Delian yelled at me. He's like, "Why aren't you funding him?" And because all the AI people were going crazy. And so he walked into my office and said, if you've taught me anything, it's that if you find an extraordinary founder with a big market opportunity, don't ask any questions because you're just going to make a mistake. So as I reacted, I was like, "Oh shit, okay, well he's an extraordinary founder, so give him a term sheet." Turns out, there's a religion in AI experts, just like there's a religion in everything else. And we don't always see the internal Silicon Valley religions as well. But if you think about it, if you didn't go to Stanford and get a PhD, or you didn't go to CMU and get a PhD, and you want to do AI, everybody dismisses you. And there's often a better approach to get from point A to point B than following the classic AI approach, which is what Google Waymo and people like that do. So I think we're going to be right on this one.
Yeah. How do you think about the unbundling of LinkedIn?
Good question.
What's the opportunity there?
Yeah, if I knew how to do it, I would do it. I've funded things at the margin. Back in the Khosla days, I funded Piazza, which is unbundling the young up-and-coming technical talent. Probably some of the audience used Piazza.
You did another testing one?
Well, we did KV, different partner of mine, funded this thing, Pymetrics, which basically uses games and predictive algorithms to identify where you're the best fit instead of interviews, which is doing quite well. It's a really good company called Pymetrics. I've done some stuff in the hourly worker space who typically are not on LinkedIn anyway. Imagine you're working retail or restaurants. You don't usually use LinkedIn. So it's not really debundling as much as adjacent. Right. But I've never seen something that completely replaces the LinkedIn.
But is it just rig up for every vertical?
Maybe. I mean, rig up's certainly a very good company. We at Founders Fund love the company and then funded it, for years. I don't know what the answer is. I would certainly I would love to hear pitches on how to unbundle it, especially at the core of the white collar business professional. I mean, GitHub in some ways is unbundled a little bit in the software engineering world. That's sort of the most important thing you send as an engineer is probably links to your Git, not your LinkedIn profile. Yeah. Business people are still though, if you're a product manager, you're probably sending your LinkedIn profile. Yeah. So I don't exactly know how to do it, but it almost surely can be done.
Right. So we at OnDeck are thinking about something. I'm curious to get your perspective. This is very new. I don't think I've shared this with you yet, and I'm just doing this for the audience that wants to listen to this. So it's called Cosine, and basically the idea is, could you create a graph based on who people actually vouch for each other? Sure. So a scarcity based graph, you only have 5 picks or 10 picks. If you had, remember MySpace, personal top 8. If you had everyone sort of top 8 professionally, if you believe that you could create that. Is that valuable? Where is the value there? how do you monetize or build a business on top of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good idea. I think the hardest part.
This is what it looks like, folks.
Yeah, I think it's generally a pretty good idea. I think the biggest challenge is will it spread? Because if it spreads, you can solve all the other stuff, like how to monetize and all that stuff will take care of itself at scale. Like LinkedIn, when I joined LinkedIn, we had no revenue, and that it was concerning in some ways. As sign of times in 2005, companies that had no revenue, it was too close to the internet bubble collapsing, so everybody's stressed about it. But if you get enough scale with professional people with professional reputations, there's plenty of ways to monetize it. So I would just be concerned about, can it actually, top 8 on both Facebook and MySpace spread incredibly. I used to run the Top Friends app on Facebook, which was 100 million Facebook users. Wow. So it was very popular. It's very popular personally. So if you could scale it, I think you can solve all the other problems. I don't know if it'll scale though. Yeah. And that's really that. The acid test is just, you can roll it out right now. Yeah. Just see if it spreads. One good thing about that product, the question probably users will ask in the beginning is why to do this. And if you can come up with a single player mode answer that seems compelling, then it can probably spread. I don't know how to do the single player mode answer for that one right away. Yeah. But if it does spread, then I think I could certainly figure out how to navigate the rest. So if you can get to the first million, this is why I talk about LinkedIn the same way. The miracle of LinkedIn was the first 100,000 users. Now, after that, it was very obvious, what to do. It's just why would the first 1,000 people join? It makes no sense. Totally. Once you have 100,000 people, if you want to do reference checks, you want to search for PM, you want to search for an engineer, you could find people. But the first 1,000, what the hell? Why? Right. It makes it literally irrational. Totally. So that's the really hard challenge, but you could try it in different ways. You can kind of try somewhat different framing and see if you can get a little bit of a viral adoption.
Yeah, I'll respond to this point, then we'll move on to a different topic. So we have 3 categories. It's up-and-comers, people who've shaped your career, and work with anywhere. And the idea is that you'd want to sign an up-and-comer as sort of a early social capital investment. So 10 years from now, you co-sign me, I'm the next unicorn investor, you're an up-and-coming investor, you say, I discovered Erik. You build, the next fund manager is going to build a track record based on, hey, I discovered Delian, I discovered Erik, I discovered next Keith, etc. And the shape my career is sort of a form of bragging, which is, hey, Erik, Keith shaped my career, I'm friends with Keith, and people are going to want to do it.
I would just do this. I think to some extent it's the kind of product that you just build and ship it and see what happens, and then look for things that are anomalously better than you expect. Yeah. People like to do X more than you thought, and they don't like to do Y. And then kind of edit and revolve from there. But this is a very common reaction of mine. One of my favorite companies ever that I just invested another $60 million in.
Fair.
Yeah. When they first pitched me on this, have you heard this story? Yeah. When they first pitched me on it, I looked up and I said, this is not obviously terrible, which they now have a quote in their office. That's amazing. Yeah. So I went from not obviously terrible to leading their seed round, co-leading the A, and now leading their whatever C or D round, $60 million. So I can be persuaded.
Yeah. And so what did they persuade you on exactly? What was proven?
The thing that they persuaded me,
what did they prove out?
There's 2 things. One was a little bit of researchy kind of management consultant-y stuff, which was, I was going to invest anyway because 2 of the 4 co-founders worked for me at Square. And so I kind of was looking for a reason to fund them. So biased positively, but that's why I said it's not obviously terrible, meaning it's above bar, here's the money kind of thing. But what they discovered that wasn't obvious was that there's a financial services component to what they were doing. And then the product market founder fit was quite strong because all 4 of the founders had worked on things at Square and Square Capital, which is very relevant to what they do. Before, when it was more like a marketplace of here's these SKUs and we tell this retailer over there which of these sort of SKUs to stock. It was a good problem, but it wasn't directly leveraging all of their skills. There was some data science, and Max had sold umbrellas and stuff, and it wasn't so far off central casting, but it wasn't right down the middle. As soon as they figured out that there's a financial services component of basically providing financing options to our retailers, that's very attractive. That's right down the middle of what they know how to do, and they know how to do better than other people in the world, because that's what Square Capital does, is it gives money to long tail retailers all the time. So then I was like, oh my God, you're the perfect people to do this. This is a great idea. How do I give you more money? So it can switch. There's another one I talked about occasionally publicly, a company called Wander Jaunt. some ex-DoorDash guys who I really liked and highly regarded. And again, I was kind of looking for a reason to fund them, but they walked in with an idea. And they're like, we're going to build a consistent brand experience on Airbnb-like properties. And I'm like, oh my God, please don't do this. Like, do anything else and I'll give you money, but please don't do this one. And Michael, who's the CEO, finished the meeting and said, well, what would I have to prove to you that would change your mind? It's a very thoughtful question. So I looked up and I was like, okay, well, what would it be? What was underlying my, almost like religiously negative reaction? And I was like, 1, 2, 3, like, show me this, this, and this. So he walks away, thank you, et cetera. About a month goes by, and he emails me. He's like, okay, I've proven those things. Can we get together? I'm like, sure. So he shows up and in a very coherent, incredibly thoughtful deck, walks me through the evidence of all these 3 things. I'm like, okay, here's your money. Yeah. I promised you if you can prove it. So I led the seed round and then recently led another round actually at Founders Fund.
Yeah. I wonder what he would have said if you had reversed the question and said, what would need to be true for you to stop working on this idea?
Yeah, that's probably not that useful. That the founders don't usually react that well to that. Partially it's their baby. I mean, I think sometimes you have to let someone chase their dream a little bit. More often than not, they'll realize that they're hitting some, pretty significant friction, and they'll come back to you and say, "What do I do?" Versus sometimes you have to suffer a little bit with a problem before you're willing to take alternative ideas into account.
Totally.
So it's sometimes better to let people go chase an idea for a while.
I want to talk about regulated markets and then frontier markets. So maybe regulated, putting your investor hat on. A lot of people are exploring ideas in healthcare, in fintech, where you've built and invested in a bunch of companies. What are things to look out for there? Do's or don'ts that are absolutely necessary?
So I love regulated markets. I love those that have legal risk, partially the virtue of being a lawyer, or no longer a lawyer, but having been a lawyer or a recovering lawyer or something, is actually I like the more legal risk, the better, because I feel like I have a competitive advantage assessing legal risk than all the other VCs. So I don't have to call up some expert and say, hey, what do you think of this? Yeah. And the expert lawyer is like, oh, that's really risky. That doesn't really help you. So I can do the business analysis and the legal thinking in my own brain. Mm-hmm. And so not accidentally, financial services and healthcare are areas I love to invest in. It's not I don't think it's random. So the more legal risk in some ways, the better. If you walk in and say, hey, this is what I'm arbitraging, this is how I'm going to solve it, I'm paying much more attention than usual, just hearing that. That said, you're going to run into some investors, especially in early days, that are going to be immediately allergic. Yeah. Because what they're going to do is call some lawyer friend of theirs up, and the lawyer's going to be like, here's all the 7 things that can go wrong. And it's going to be pretty hard to convince them to take the risk on you unless you already have some traction, or unless the VC has already funded something somewhat comparable. Right. And so when the lawyer says, here's all the 7 things that are going to go wrong, they know how to say, you know what, those 6, I don't care about those. Those aren't going to really happen. I care about this one. So let's talk about this one. Yeah. If you can't isolate the VC's brain down to there's one core thing, they're never going to invest. I actually dealt with one of these today where somewhat different problem, but the XYC company came to me for advice more than money, actually, truthfully. YC partners had sent them to me, and they're going to want to raise money. And I said, look, there's only 6 VCs you can pitch. Because if someone hasn't funded something in this space before, there's too many complexities to what you're doing. You're never going to get the partner comfortable enough that they understand all these moving pieces. And certainly when they go talk to their other partners, the other partners are going to barf. Right. So these 6 VCs, though, have funded comparable companies. So the kinds of problems that are going to scare people, they already have in their portfolio. Yeah. Was it a space company? Or no. It's financial. It's generally financial services. Okay. But it's just edgy enough where there's just enough combination of complicated things, and you trying to teach it to someone who hasn't experienced it before, they're just going to get terrified of all these things that could go wrong. And so I was like, fortunately for you, there's several successful companies that have comparable components, but you need to go find a VC who has one of those components in their portfolio. Yeah. And what about, take out legal risk, what about sort of business model risk? Like some people are loath to fund sort of EMR companies or companies that sell to providers generally, or lending businesses. I love lending businesses. I mean, we fund both at KV and at Founders Fund, companies that I call it use debt as oxygen companies. So the art to those is really twofold. Do you have some asymmetric ability to price the debt? Yeah. And that's easier said than done. But if you do, it's great because there's infinite sources of debt in the world at the moment. And if you have an asymmetric ability to price it, you're going to earn a lot of money. Yeah. Then you need a distribution strategy. They're somewhat related, but they're somewhat orthogonal. Financial services is a big market, but very competitive. There's lots of people who have a lot of money. They spend a lot of money on marketing. So you need some thoughtful way to distribute the product. If you have an answer to both, underwriting advantage and some distribution advantage, then I'd love to invest and would do it all day long. A firm had both from the beginning.
Are you opening your aperture a little bit to global? I'm curious, are there sort of companies where it's like, hey, this business model makes a lot of sense, like a firm for Latin America?
Not me personally, but I think at FF, we are certainly looking more globally, more frequently. Yeah, I like generally companies that can work with the founders pretty actively. And with distance and with time zone differences, it's just very difficult to be an active consigliere. Totally. We have funded, I'm pushing the envelope here. I funded 3 companies in New York now. Wow. I'm really, I've gone from you must be within 30 miles to 2,547 miles. So, I'll probably do more of that. But as a fund, we're definitely open to more. We've had some success. We funded a new bank in Latin America that's done well. We funded a few that look promising. So we're trying to find ways to do more.
What would need to be true for you to believe that remote first companies can make sense? Or do you think that that's good?
Well, we funded at KV from the very beginning, right out of YC, GitLab, which is remote first, and it's done phenomenally well. I think it's going to be larger and more successful than GitHub. Yeah. So it's possible. I think it depends a little bit on the shot you're taking, which is if you kind of know what you need to build, it might work fine. And, the more San Francisco messes things up with various crazy policies and people, the more it's going to just force this. And it may not it just may be not a choice anymore. But if you know what you're building, I think you can probably do it remotely. But a lot of company building is sort of brainstorming, sort of serendipitous conversations that lead to, well, what if we mix this product over here with this product over there and change this? That's a lot harder to do. Yeah. So once either you have a clear product market fit, you know how to get product market fit, it's much easier to envision this. Yeah. It's also a management technique skill thing. First time managers, a lot of companies that have done very well have first time managers. Managing the people sitting next to you is pretty damn hard, just like when they're sitting next to you. The more you've developed the skill of managing, extending it to people you don't see and work with every day might be much more tractable.
Bill Gurley, I think, in an interview many years ago, said that as software continues to eat the world and we invest in physical businesses, that we settle for lower margins. And so I'm curious, would you have done WeWork? How do you make sense of what's happening with WeWork? How do you make sense of sort of Ben Thompson's sort of neither nor post about what is or isn't a tech company?
Yeah, I love Ben Thompson's I love all Ben Thompson's posts, but certainly really, really highly recommend the post on how to think through what's a tech company, what's a tech-enabled company, what's the criteria, how should they be valued. It's the canonical piece on the topic. But it's probably better to read that in the original versus like me try to distill it. Second, I don't think margins matter as much as people think. I think that cash flow matters, and it's somewhat different. So let me give you an example. Imagine you have a business that kicks off, call it 10%, which is a low margin, but it grows to be 10% of everything on the planet. Let's call this Visa. You can be a pretty big business. So the question isn't the margin measured as a percentage. It's how much of a tax are are you taxing enough set of things? And what's the expense and friction of putting that tax in the first place? So if you have to spend a lot of money to create the Visa, getting back paid little micro pennies at a time, that's very expensive because you have to raise a lot of capital before it really offsets. Yeah. And that's why margin in some ways isn't like crazy to think about because it's a rough proxy for how fast you pay back the expenditure of capital. If, on the other hand, you have let's take your LinkedIn example, that's not going to cost you any money to spread. Whether it pays back 1 cent or 10 cents or $1 per whatever, it just doesn't matter because you haven't spent anything up front. The only expenditure is like whoever engineers and designers built the damn thing, and that's like almost like a fixed cost. Then it's going to be marginally free. Yeah. So if you could capture 1 cent on every hiring decision, it sounds like low, but how many hiring decisions are there a year times how many years? It just doesn't matter because there's no payback problem. Yeah. But a lot of people have to use money. It's more true than false that you have to use money to spread to customers and users. If you do, then you need to worry about how fast does that money come back to you because otherwise you're going to be raising money infinitely. Yep. So to me, it's a function of what's the cost of acquiring a customer. And as that approaches zero, then the concern about the margin also approaches zero. Yeah. And if the cost of acquiring a customer is very expensive, then you need to worry not a percentage, but how many dollars come back to you in terms of, it's almost like contribution profit dollars is probably the right metric. Like how many dollars come back to the company for everything we do. And then against the friction of getting that contribution relationship started.
Totally. Back to frontier markets for a second. How do you think about sort of emerging space, crypto, VR, AR, other sort of emerging technologies and platforms when people identify, like, how do you think about timing or?
Well, again, not being a top-down investor, I don't have like strong, religious views on most of those topics. I do think that the key is sequencing progress for those companies. Those companies need to be able to show progress at the same pace as all other companies because you're competing for roughly the same talent.
Yep.
So you're not going to run out of money as much as you're going to demoralize your employees if you can't make progress at a fast enough pace. Yeah. But the progress milestones don't have to be customers.
Yep.
They can be technical progress. Basically, again, I'd go to the whiteboard. What are the biggest risks to this business? And a lot of them are not going to be customer based. Some of the actually hard tech companies often, there's no customer risk. They think rockets. Typically, these companies have hundreds of millions of dollars in orders. The only question is, can they put the damn rocket in space without blowing up? Yeah. But they'll have billions of dollars in contracts like overnight if they can do that reliably. So the hard part is proving at small doses of capital or relatively compressed doses of capital with a relatively compressed time frame in a hot labor market that you can actually deliver the product per spec.
Yep.
So I think that's the only thing I care about is what are the milestones and how fast can you achieve them against what dose of time and money do you need to prove those milestones?
Yeah. I want to end on a sort of uplifting note, deeply relevant to our entrepreneurs. So I'll sort of, a couple questions I have for you. One is Warren going to win in 2020? What's happening? Is Facebook going to get broken up? Is the U.S. on a downturn?
Easy. These are going to be really easy.
I haven't heard you talk about politics in a while, so maybe, predictions for the next couple of years.
I don't think Warren's going to be the nominee.
Really?
No.
Who?
I think I've said for 9 months, 10 months, 11 months, Buttigieg's going to be the nominee. Best call of my career because I predicted it like February last year. Wow. But yeah, I'd say now it's actually becoming more like realistic. Everybody really thought I was insane.
No Andrew Yang. Sorry. No Andrew Yang. I know you hate UBI.
No, he's not. He's doing better than expected, truthfully. If he was a startup, actually his progress against metrics is actually quite good.
Yep. And that is the right way we should think about these people as startups, right?
To some extent, but this is a very binary. So it's like a startup with a binary outcome, though. And so there are some dimensions, and there's also a very finite other thing that people forget about sometimes from Silicon Valley is all elections have a very finite deadline. Like it doesn't matter if you would have won the race a week later.
Yeah. Totally.
There's one date you get measured at. So it is different. But, Buttigieg will be the nominee. If Warren's the nominee, she's definitely going to lose. I think people are also figuring that out starting actually this morning. New York Times even figured it out. If it's certainly going to affect, if she were to win, it would definitely affect Silicon Valley a lot.
Yeah.
Depends also what happens, the subtle nuances, depends what would happen in the Senate.
Yep.
Because you can imagine a scenario where the Democrats elect a president, but the Senate is still Republican, in which case nothing radical is going to change in terms of tax code. So unless there's like a macro wave that changes the Senate composition to be a majority Democrat with the Warren presidency, that would absolutely change Silicon Valley, though, a fair amount pretty quickly.
How do you think about the tech lash? Does that continue? It feels like big tech is at war with big government.
I don't know if that's true. I think this is a journalist-inspired, crusade. Talked about 2 years ago with Kara Swisher. Yeah. I think journalists are just jealous of tech companies. And
because they're direct competitors.
Well, they're direct competitors. They've lost their gatekeeping role. They also see people they went to college with making a lot of money. Yeah. There's a lot of reasons. So I think most of this is fiction. That said, if you hear it enough, it's like stereo surround sound. But if you look at the polls, there's some rigorous research on this. Other than Facebook, if you look at the popularity of any other tech company, pick your favorite ones, Amazon on down, you cannot find any change in the popularity of those companies over the last 5 years.
Yep.
Facebook definitely has had material changes in its popularity. But that's not a tech backlash, that's a Facebook backlash. Yep. And, you can argue why should it be the case, whatever. But fundamentally, these polls are taken every year. And the three of the five most admired companies in the U.S. are tech companies. It seems pretty inconsistent, with this tech backlash. Also, when I travel outside New York or San Francisco, tech is still very aspirational. Like all my high school friends, for example, want their kids to get into tech. Like I get constantly like asked, when I run into high school friends, like how do you get into tech, blah, blah, blah. It's like, this is like normal New Jersey middle class. Yeah. Like it's totally aspirational.
Are we in a stagnation? Do you expect this to continue? How do you think about the possibilities of a downturn? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't predict like macro markets. I mean, that's like almost like a fool's errand, and certainly I'm not qualified to do that. But I think I like Peter's statement on this, which is we're 10 years closer to whatever recession we're going to have than we used to be. But like, is there asymmetric downside to the economy? Maybe. Yeah. That's probably a fair statement if you think in terms of probability. If you do this kind of probabilistic analysis, how much better can the economy get versus would it get worse? Certainly the trade stuff, even if wise, meaning like the substantive trade policies of the U.S. government may make sense geopolitically, but they're going to have absolutely a fetter on the economy. So the decision to confront China may be very, very wise. Yep. But it's going to have a drag coefficient in economic performance in the short term. And that's probably inescapable.
Does China overtake the U.S. in global superpower in the next decade?
Depends. I think that it's a function of whether the U.S. pays attention. And, to his credit, one of the things I think there's two things that Trump's been extremely astute about that most people, even a majority of people in Silicon Valley, would probably have to give him credit for.
Trade.
Confronting China. Not trade per se. I think free trade is probably still more popular here than certainly in the administration. But I think people neglected the threat that China poses on several dimensions for a very long time. And that's probably been a good thing to pay attention to it and start the analysis and very careful analysis of what China's up to and why. Secondly is on the FDA. The FDA has been much more progressive and innovative in approving novel ways to treat people and improve people's lives. They're very thoughtful, actually, now. If you wanted to submit data that suggested that you had this product that would diagnose a heart attack better than a cardiologist or cancer earlier than an oncologist, the FDA is very receptive and very thoughtful about how they look at those metrics, and they will approve things that don't require traditional doctors. So I think the innovation in medicine has actually been pretty good under the Trump administration and will continue. A little bit of liberalization in financial services of the availability perhaps of bank charters to startups, which has been basically impossible in the U.S. for like the last 15 years, unlike in Europe, appears to be. None of the U.S. company startups have yet been granted a charter. Several are publicly working on it, Square, et cetera. But I think if Trump wins re-election, almost surely some startups that we're all familiar with will wind up with bank charters, which would be somewhat progressive.
Yeah. In contrast to China, which is, poster child for centralization, the biology turned me on to Sovereign Individual.
Oh, yeah.
And many others.
Yeah, the 1998 book that's incredibly prescient.
Yes. And basic thesis is that we're going to change from citizens of governments, we exist to serve governments, to customers of governments, where governments exist to serve us. And so the implications of that is that there will be markets for governance, and the world might look like increasingly decentralized city-states. Is that a world over the next 50 years that makes sense for you? Or
I think the logic's pretty powerful, and certainly the predictive. The book's amazing in terms of predicting things. 20 years in advance, which is rare. The question is, what's the catalyzing function? A lot of things, there's inertia, and the same thing is true of startups. Inverting inertia is really hard, and I don't see too much evidence that that part's inverting. I think the logic of why it should invert, the negative reaction to centralized governments is clear. Populism in some ways is a revolt against that. But what catalyzes it into a constructive sort of decentralized nation state environment, I don't know.
Yeah. Clippers, Lakers, who you got in the NBA this year?
Oh, man. My Knicks are still terrible. Now, at least we have the Warriors now to be commiserated. Yes. But, the Knicks one day. I think we'll have decentralized nation states before the Knicks win something.
Yeah, I've watched the games. Knicks have had a chance to win every single game this year and lost it within the last 2 minutes.
That's actually, in some ways, that's actually progress. No, if you read The Score Takes Care of Itself, which is the fundamental, book by Bill Walsh about how to build a company. Well, it's how to build a football team program, but how to build a company, in my view. If you really take that seriously, that is actually progress. Yeah. Because his basic point is if you do everything the right way and constantly master it, eventually you're going to win. Yeah. And so if you go from losing games by a large amount to losing them by a small amount and you continue to make progress, then that will eventually mean you win a lot of games.
Totally. James Dolan, if you're listening to this, trade Julius Randle. sell the team.
Erik's buying.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so in closing, I'll ask you a personal question. How do you think about maximizing your own learning between you read a lot, you talk to a lot of smart people? What patterns have you sort of found? And then another thing that, close mutual friends will tell me about you is that you sort of, this is sort of an oxymoron for you in some ways, but mellowed out a little bit in the last 5 years, last decade, perhaps, relative to where you used to be. Does that resonate with you?
In reverse order, I think it's easy to be mellow as a VC, truthfully. Yeah. I don't know if it's like age. It's just that running something is a really hard job. Actually, truthfully, you're always under constant stress. You have constant fires you're fighting. Yeah. Venture is a difficult job. It's not actually easy necessarily to be successful as a venture investor, but it's a pretty predictable pace, and you rarely have urgent crises. Yeah. And so you can be a little bit more quote unquote mellow, and that may be optical, sort of versus role specific versus the constant. It's like, if you're coaching a football team in the NFL, it's probably not the least mellow job you can have on the planet. Versus if you were scouting for an NFL team, it's a lot easier to be mellow because you write these reports and then someone acts on it, et cetera. So it's a bit like that. It's really hard to manage like hundreds of people all the time. One of the reasons why people sometimes quit and, become VCs. That's the positive version. The negative version would be like, it's too many years in California. So I grew up on the East Coast where nobody's mellow. Totally. Everybody's fast talker, fast thinker. And, mellow is like definitely a negative pejorative. But 19 years here, maybe you start, becoming more Californian.
I don't think you're slowing down too much.
No, I've certainly I've led more investments, over the last 7 years than any other VC, and by a lot. And I think probably every year have led more more investments of like above like $2 or $3 million in every other VC.
Do you think you'll be doing that for the next 10 years, 20 years?
That is a great question. Not if Elizabeth Warren's president. And then on the other topic, I like to read. I mean, fundamentally, the way I learn new things is mostly reading. It's just such a high leverage activity. I love to read. If I could find more time to read, I would. That's where I sacrifice the most. It's easy to eat up junk food with meetings and workouts and other things. Yeah. Reading is the substance, and there's always an excuse not to read.
Yeah. Is there any last words that come to mind for this On Deck audience? People starting their companies, thinking about different spaces. Anything we didn't touch?
Well, I mean, this may not be in your self-interest, but I wouldn't be afraid of joining something either. Like, I think that's, we kind of glossed over this, and one of the reasons why we had EIRs at KV was that if you find somebody else who has a great idea and a great vision that resonates with you, and people that you think you can work with and learn from, that may be a better choice. Like, the need to be a founder, I think is a bad idea. And so EIRs typically are set up to both investigate their own ideas and also meet with a lot of companies that come in that might be a good fit for their skills. And so I wouldn't over jump into I must be the founder versus I can find this climate change company, that's really important to me. Great. I didn't know that existed. Wow, these people are really smart. I could learn from them and work with them. Yeah. So I would look for opportunities like that as well and treat them equally, versus having a strong bias to I must found.
Yeah. I love that. And maybe last thing is obviously, what's your advice for On Deck itself as we're building this fellowship out? When right now it's it's pretty interesting, I'll come give a talk, but when is it oh wow, that's really interesting? What do you think is sort of the inflection point for us? Or
the key is ultimately for me being a people-based investor. We didn't talk that much about it. We talked about it on a prior podcast at length. What does that mean? What's the criteria for founders, exceptional founders? The key is, when does it become a magnet for people who are going to be exceptional founders or exceptional early stage executives? Yeah. And that's what I spend most of my time trying to do, is meet people, ideally meet them before other people. I mean, we talked about undiscovered talent at length in other podcasts, but fundamentally my job is to find undiscovered talent before other people find them. And there's lots of smart people that I compete with. They're actually pretty good at what they do. And so the only way I can stay relevant is to find the next, generation of smart, talented, potential proto-entrepreneurs, before my competitors figure out who they are. Yeah. So if you become a magnet for them, then I'll move in here or something. Yeah. Put a camera. Yes. Face recognition from China.
Exactly.
That'd be great.
Hopefully some of them are here. Everyone, please give a round of applause for Keith. Thank
you. If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.